Biogeochemical cycles. Interdependence is when two or more things depend on one another in order to survive or become successful. And in this video, that's what you're going to do. You're going to obtain and evaluate and communicate how organisms rely on each other in their environment. And so we want to develop and use models of how matter is cycled throughout an entire ecosystem. We'll learn how this happens through different processes. There are really three main cycles in biology that we want to really study. The hydraulic cycle, which you might know is the water cycle, carbon cycle, and the nitrogen cycle. These cycles represent how the movement of particles and matter move through a living system and even through non-living systems. These living systems make up ecosystems. And since matter cannot be created nor destroyed, Earth is a closed system. These essential nutrients, they must continually be cycled throughout the planet. Alrighty, on to the carbon cycle. So carbon, that's the basic organic molecule or element, as you will, for all living organic molecules on the actual planet. And it's found in a variety of different forms, not just elemental carbon or carbon dioxide. But carbon changes its form, unlike water, which always kind of stays as H2O. Carbon can interact with a lot of different elements and become different things. Like carbon dioxide is a gas that's usually, in the atmosphere and trapped under lower places. In pollution, we'll talk more about that too. But it also is found in things like glucose. So it's found in a variety of different forms and places. Carbon being the basic element all living things need, it is found in the macromolecules. These are very large molecules that are necessary for living things. Carbon is found in proteins, carbohydrates, lipids, and nucleic acids. So proteins, they make up our muscles and skin, and carbohydrates are things like starches and sugars. And then lipids are fats, oils, waxes, and nucleic acid that's found within our cells, DNA, RNA. It's also found in our atmosphere as carbon dioxide. And believe it or not, carbon is found in all minerals and rocks and fossil fuels too. So underneath the ground, carbon can be contained in oil, stored as a hydrocarbon, natural gas, organic living material in the soil, and aquatic sediments also contain lots of carbon. As a biology student, you need to learn the main stages of the carbon cycle. So there's photosynthesis, so plants will capture that carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and they're going to use that, remember, to make glucose. In cellular respiration, carbon dioxide released into the atmosphere as a waste product from metabolism is used. And then, of course, consumption. So one organism is going to need another organism, and that is used in the form of carbon. Decomposition is when the breakdown of these large carbon molecules into more useful things. So decomposers break down carbon. It's usually from when organisms die, and they're basically recycling that carbon back into the soil. And there's also fossilization. That converts carbon from things that once used to be alive a long time ago. The term fossil, that's where the term fossil fuel comes through. As over when organisms died a very long time ago, they fell to the bottom of the ocean, and through intense heat and pressure were converted back into carbon through fossilization. And then even the humans, we add to it through a combustion process. Like when we burn those fossil fuels, we release into the atmosphere carbon dioxide from burning. We have a decomposition part here, so living organisms, things like bacteria and earthworms and lots of different fungus, they will decompose. They'll break down dead material and nutrients and return it to either the soil or back into the ecosystem. Photosynthetic organisms like algae that we've talked before, but all plants and things that are green, they remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere that all these other processes have put out there, and they will convert that into simple sugars. Animals, plants, and fungus, they do what's called cellular respiration. And so, in order to break down carbon rich foods and glucose and other molecules, they do that, they break it down for energy. And so there is a huge human impact when it comes to the carbon cycle. How do humans participate in this? Can you think of ways that they would? How do we contribute to the carbon cycle as living organisms? And how do we negatively impact that? And one of the main things that we did talk about in this presentation was combustion. When we take up old fossilized things like fossil fuels and we burn them, we apply a huge amount of heat to them. Those fossils contain a lot of carbon, and when we burn that, we cause a huge increase in carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. The nitrogen cycle is one of the most important things, and it's oftentimes what I find most difficult for students to learn. So like carbon, nitrogen, it takes on a variety of different chemical forms. So we can find it in the atmosphere. It's usually as an N2 gas, so that's two nitrogen molecules stuck together. We actually call that elemental elemental nitrogen, diatomic nitrogen. Plants and animals, we cannot really use nitrogen in this form, and so other things have to happen in order for nitrogen to be useful for us. We can't really, take it out of the atmosphere. Nitrogen cycle is found in macromolecules. Typically proteins and nucleic acid are what you hear about nitrogen being found the most, but we can also find it in our waste products. Also, it's in the soil, of course, which we'll learn about here at length in a minute, and of course fossil fuels. The most important thing is that nitrogen needs to be fixed. So in two ways, bacteria and yes, lightning will fix nitrogen in the soil. So bacteria that are in the soil, and they can also be in water, they convert nitrogen from the air, that N2 gas, into a form that plants and animals can use. We call that nitrogen fixation. It also happens in the atmosphere when lightning strikes, but that's actually a pretty small proportion of nitrogen fixation. Usually these specialized bacteria, they do all the work. And consumption, when one organism eats another, it's going to get the nitrogen from those other organisms that it ate. Decomposition, when things decompose, so we have decomposers, remember, like bacteria isn't a good example. They break down dead matter, and they will take those huge organic molecules and break them into much smaller parts, returning nitrogen to the soil. Ammonification, which is when these bacteria, they convert nitrogen from waste. Most of the time this is a urine process, but it does happen in fecal matter too. But it basically will convert your urine, uric acid, into ammonia. We call that ammonification. Nitrification is when those bacteria convert nitrogen into ammonia. Also into nitrates and nitrites. The difference between those two is just an oxygen molecule. But in any event, the bacteria are doing this for us, and we want to convert into those nitrates and nitrites, which is NO2 and NO3, because that's how plants are going to absorb it into their roots. This is how nitrogen basically will enter the food chain, and it'll eventually reach us and other animals once we eat those plants. Denitrification is when the bacteria convert that nitrogen that's in ammonia back into N2 gas so that it can go back into the atmosphere. So bacteria, they get kind of a bad rap sometimes, but they're sure doing a lot of work for us. And they're a huge, huge player in the nitrogen cycle. The nitrogen cycle in an aquatic environment is something that students also need to be familiar with. So let's just take a fish. This is a betta fish. These should look familiar to a lot of you. A betta fish eats food, right, either through plants or we feed it, and that betta fish is going to produce waste in the form of urine and, of course, in the form of solid waste. That's like waste. There's also other organic matter kind of floating around inside of your fish tank, we'll just say, or in a lake. When the fish releases that waste, it is ammonia, and that ammonia has we'll find specialized bacteria that are going to turn it into nitrates. Nitrites. These nitrates and nitrites are being turned from this waste product into something that is usable for plants to uptake through bacteria. Now, these bacteria, they're called nitrobacteria. They are a specialized bacteria that we can actually try to see in certain plants. Have you ever pulled up something like, like something that you've been growing, like a crop, or something that you might have planted in the garden, and you pull up a plant and it has these circular little pink things stuck to the bottom of the roots, and sometimes they look like, well, it's part of the root system, but it's not. It's those little nodules that these nitrobacteria form underground. And their job is to basically turn ammonia into nitrates and nitrites so that the plants can use them. And of course, when plants get the right amount of nutrition that they need, they can grow and the organisms can consume them again, and the cycle begins all over. So one way that the nitrogen cycle is very different from a lot of other biogeochemical cycles is that there's no step that is completed without the help of living organisms. So we're not really relying on physical properties like the physical structure of carbon to bond with other things, or the physical structure and polarity and charge of water to interact with the rest of the things on the planet. We rely on living organisms to drive the nitrogen cycle to happen. Bacteria are the most important living organism when it comes to converting nitrogen into different forms. Like, there are specialized bacteria that we need, and they are useful in just doing that, creating this high amount of nitrogen gas and transforming it into something that other living things can use. Fungus and other decomposers, they are good at breaking down these nitrogen-rich waste products and also putting useful nitrogen products back into the system. So how do humans impact the nitrogen cycle? How do we participate in that? And how do we contribute to that nitrogen cycle? Can we, if this is about bacteria, can we negatively impact this cycle? So a couple examples that we did talk about were fertilizers. So when we use fertilizers, we're adding nitrogen basically to the soil. We're pouring these nitrogen and some other products onto our crop in order to get it to grow. We're not really waiting on the bacteria to do their job. So this basically creates this excess nitrogen sitting in the soil, and we can experience a lot of runoff, and then of course that runoff will take all that nitrogen downstream into a lake, and when we have excess nutrients in a water system, we get eutrophication, the building up of algae. And why is that bad? We will definitely talk about at length, but think about it as the water getting really, really green and slimy and cloudy. And if you're a fish and you're living in that water system, your life has become very difficult when there's lots of plant material to move around. Also, in the form of combustion, humans can negatively impact that. Like we said, in the carbon cycle, when we burn those old fossil fuels, that does release a lot of excess nitrogen that's into the atmosphere that was once basically trapped deep underground, and we have now uplifted it and tossed it into our atmosphere.